Alright everyone, today we are going to examine a very popular idea in global politics. You hear it everywhere, in newspapers, on television, in political speeches, and especially in discussions about the future of international relations. The idea is this: the United States and China are entering a new Cold War. Many analysts argue that the rivalry between Washington and Beijing today mirrors the geopolitical struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union during the 20th century, two superpowers, two competing systems, two rival blocs dividing the world. If you listen to these arguments, the conclusion seems obvious. History is repeating itself, but today I want to suggest something a little controversial. What if this idea is wrong? What if the so-called US-China Cold War is actually an illusion? To answer that question, we must begin by understanding what the Cold War actually was. Because if we misunderstand the original Cold War, we will misunderstand the world we are living in today. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was not simply a rivalry between two powerful states. It was a global system of separation. Two economic systems that barely interacted, two military alliances that defined the structure of world politics, two ideological visions competing for the future of humanity. The United States represented liberal capitalism, the Soviet Union represented state socialism, and the entire planet seemed to divide itself along those lines. On one side stood NATO, on the other side stood the Warsaw Pact. Countries were expected to choose: either you belong to the Western Bloc or you belong to the Soviet Bloc. There was very little room in between, and this division was reinforced by the structure of the global economy. The Soviet Union and the United States did not depend on each other economically. Trade between them was minimal, their financial systems were separate, their technologies evolved independently. Their political alliances were rigid. In other words, the Cold War was not just a political rivalry. It was a system of global separation. Now let us compare that situation with the relationship between the United States and China today. At first glance, the similarities appear striking. Both countries are powerful. Both compete for global influence, both invest heavily in military technology, both criticize each other's political systems. It is therefore tempting to conclude that we are witnessing the beginning of a new Cold War. But once we begin examining the relationship more carefully, something interesting emerges: the structure of the U.S.-China relationship is fundamentally different from the structure of the US-Soviet rivalry. The most important difference lies in economics. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were largely disconnected from one another economically. But today, the United States and China are deeply interconnected. China is one of the largest trading partners of the United States. American companies manufacture products in Chinese factories. Chinese companies depend on American consumers. Supply chains stretch across the Pacific Ocean. The economies of the two countries are intertwined in ways that would have been unimaginable during the 20th century. This is one of the defining features of the modern global economy. Globalization has created networks of production that span continents. A smartphone assembled in China may contain semiconductors designed in the United States, software written in California, rare minerals mined in Africa, and components manufactured in Japan and South Korea. The result is an economic system in which many countries depend on each other simultaneously. In such a system, complete separation becomes extremely difficult. Now, this does not mean that competition between the United States and China is not real. There are genuine disagreements, trade disputes, technological rivalry, security concerns in the Pacific, and tensions surrounding Taiwan. But competition does not automatically mean Cold War, because a Cold War requires something very specific. It requires two systems that are largely isolated from each other, and that condition simply does not exist today. Instead, what we observe is a much more complicated relationship, a relationship characterized by both competition and cooperation. Economists sometimes refer to this situation as complex interdependence. Countries compete in some areas while cooperating in others. They may be rivals in technology while remaining partners in trade. They may disagree politically while still maintaining economic ties. This type of relationship is messy. It does not fit neatly into traditional geopolitical frameworks, but it is increasingly common in the modern world. Now let us examine another dimension of the Cold War analogy: ideology. During the Cold War, ideological conflict was central. The United States and the Soviet Union promoted competing visions of political organization. Each side believed that its system represented the future, and each side sought to expand its influence globally. This ideological struggle shaped conflicts across the world, from Korea to Vietnam, from Latin America to Africa. But when we examine the relationship between the United States and China today, ideology plays a different role. China does not attempt to export its political system in the same way the Soviet Union attempted to export communism. Chinese leaders focus primarily on domestic stability and economic development. They promote the idea that different countries should choose their own paths of governance. This does not eliminate ideological differences, but it does change the nature of the rivalry. Instead of a global ideological struggle, we see a competition over influence, technology, and economic leadership. This distinction is important because ideological conflicts tend to create rigid divisions. Economic competitions, by contrast, often produce overlapping relationships. Countries may cooperate in some areas while competing in others. And this is exactly what we observe in the modern international system. Now let us consider another important difference between the Cold War and today: alliances. During the Cold War, alliances were relatively clear. The United States led a network of Western allies. The Soviet Union led a network of socialist states. These alliances were formal and institutionalized. Today, the situation is far more fluid. The United States maintains strong alliances with countries such as Japan, South Korea, and members of NATO. China maintains close relationships with some countries as well. But the global system is not divided into two rigid blocks. Many countries maintain economic ties with both powers simultaneously. European nations trade extensively with China while remaining security partners of the United States. Countries in Southeast Asia seek to balance relations with both Washington and Beijing. Even close allies of the United States often hesitate to frame their relationship with China as part of a Cold War. This reflects the reality that the global economy is deeply interconnected. For many countries, choosing sides completely would be extremely costly. This brings us to another crucial point. Globalization has transformed the structure of international power. In the 20th century, economic systems were more self-contained. Countries could pursue relatively independent development strategies. But today, production networks cross borders, technological innovation involves collaboration across continents. Financial markets react instantly to events around the world. In such an environment, decoupling large economies becomes extraordinarily difficult. This does not mean it is impossible. Some degree of separation is already occurring in certain sectors. For example, the United States has introduced restrictions on advanced semiconductor exports to China. Both countries are investing heavily in domestic technology industries. These developments indicate a form of strategic competition, but even these efforts do not represent a complete economic separation. Instead, they represent selective competition in critical industries. This type of competition differs fundamentally from the global separation that defined the Cold War. Now let us consider the military dimension of the relationship. Military tensions between the United States and China have increased in recent years. Both countries are expanding their naval capabilities. While these tensions are serious, they do not produce the same global military confrontation that characterized the Cold War. Instead, they represent regional security challenges within a broader system of economic interdependence. This combination of competition and cooperation makes the US-China relationship unusually complex. It does not fit neatly into traditional categories, and this is why the Cold War analogy can be misleading. The world today is not organized around two completely separate systems. Instead, it is organized around networks of interaction. Countries cooperate, compete, and negotiate simultaneously. This creates a geopolitical environment that is far more fluid than the bipolar world of the 20th century. So if the US-China Cold War is an illusion, what kind of relationship are we actually witnessing? One possible answer is that we are entering an era of strategic competition within a shared global system. In this system, major powers compete for technological leadership, economic influence, and geopolitical advantage. But they do so within a framework that still requires cooperation. Climate change, global trade, pandemics, financial stability. These challenges cannot be addressed by one country alone. They require coordination between major powers, and this reality imposes limits on how far rivalry can escalate. In other words, the structure of globalization itself constrains the possibility of a true Cold War. This does not eliminate competition, but it changes the form that competition takes. Instead of dividing the world into rigid camps, modern competition occurs within overlapping networks. Countries interact through trade, investment, technology, and diplomacy simultaneously. The result is a geopolitical landscape that is more complicated but also more interconnected. Understanding this complexity is essential, because misinterpreting the nature of the US-China relationship can lead to dangerous policy choices. If leaders believe they are entering a Cold War, they may adopt strategies designed for a bipolar world, but the world today is not bipolar in the same way it was during the 20th century. It is multipolar, interconnected, and constantly evolving. This means that managing competition between the United States and China requires a different approach. An approach that recognizes both rivalry and interdependence, and perhaps this is the most important lesson we can draw from examining the Cold War analogy. History provides useful frameworks, but it does not repeat itself exactly. Each era produces its own patterns of power. The challenge for policymakers and analysts is to understand those patterns accurately, because if we misdiagnose the problem, we will also misjudge the solutions, and in the case of the US-China relationship. Understanding the difference between rivalry and Cold War may be one of the most important strategic questions of our time, because the future of the global order may depend on how that relationship evolves.